All right, welcome everybody to episode 64 of the Inglorious Bastards campaign. With me tonight is a language expert named Paul Strack, and I'm very excited to have him. It was in talking with Paul that I realized that this campaign or these set of interviews needed a series of language episodes, so people to come on and to know more about the language and to talk about those. So Paul Strack is he's going to come with us tonight to talk a little bit about the Quenya language. And the reason I call him an expert is because he has both started and maintained a website called Eldamo, which stands for the Elvish Data Model. And if I could just, Paul, before I ask you more about it, if I could read from your website, you call Eldamo a collection. The collection is called a lexicon because it is not a dictionary in the traditional sense. Can you tell us more about your site Eldamo and what makes it a lexicon?
Right. So I started working on this site. Oh Lord. Probably about 11 years ago now, although it didn't actually become public until about 5 years ago. And the reason why I call it a lexicon rather than a dictionary is a proper dictionary has things like definitions, and proper dictionaries, generally speaking, they just describe the words as they are now. They don't necessarily describe, a lot of modern dictionaries will have historical entries and etymologies and stuff like that, but they tend to be focused on how the language is actually used. Whereas the Tolkien languages are of sufficient complexity that they need a more complicated set of descriptions, and so the Eldamo data model will actually describes not only the words that are in the language, but also how the words in the languages are related to each other, how they evolved over time, both in the context of the universe and also how Tolkien's own thoughts about the languages evolved over time. So it's more complicated than an ordinary dictionary. So I will add that part of the reason why I don't call it a dictionary is because one of the big things missing from it right now are proper definitions of all the words. And I do hope someday to add those. So at some point in time, I may actually start calling it a dictionary, but it's not a dictionary yet.
Okay. And when you say, I think you're spot on with pretty much anything that's related to Tolkien is complicated, right? Like, and especially the languages. So this and Corey Olsen came on and he talked a little bit about how, and he's talked many times on his own podcast about how the histories have changed. Like, Tolkien's his initial concept of his world sort of evolved, and would you agree that maybe the languages did the same thing as the histories changed? Yes,
more so, probably more so than the histories themselves. Actually,
yeah.
The languages, Tolkien kept changing his mind. Now there's a chain through his writings. Not everything is changing every week, but he made some fairly major revisions to the languages as his life went along, including what the languages actually were.
And so, can you tell us which of the Elven languages he developed most? I guess because there were several languages, Adonaic, and of course the Dwarven languages, but there are two primary Elven languages. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the two main languages that Tolkien focused on were, in The Lord of the Rings, he calls them Quenya, which is the language of the High Elves, the Noldor and the Vanyar of Valinor, and Sindarin, which is the language of the elves that remained in Middle-earth. And so he spent most of his time working on those two languages. Of the two, he spent more time working on Quenya. I think that's just where he started and where his preferences lie. But he did actually spend a fair amount of time working on both languages, and he worked on them pretty much throughout his entire life. So he started working on them in the 1910s and continued to work on them up until shortly before his death in the 1970s.
Wow! And did he? I mean, he was a this was his thing, right? He was a philologist, right? He studied language and taught language. Did he borrow in developing these languages? Were there languages that he borrowed from? Do you know?
Is yes and no. So Tolkien had a deep love of languages, many different languages, as a matter of fact. He started studying languages basically when he was a kid, a teenager. He started inventing languages actually when he was a kid. But there are a couple of languages that he drew heavily for inspiration. For example, part of his original inspiration for Quenya was the Finnish language, which he encountered when he was a young man. And he liked a lot of the aspects of the language a great deal. And he borrowed some of the basic sound systems and grammatical features of Finnish when he invented Quenya. Now, I have to add a caveat. The reason why I said yes and no is, when people hear about these things, they they think Quenya is just Finnish slightly changed. And so he borrowed some sounds and some grammatical elements, but a lot of it was his own invention. In fact, almost all the vocabulary of all the languages were things that he invented. Very little of the vocabulary is actually drawn from any real-world language. In fact, every now and again, he'd stumble across a word that he thought was too close to a real-world language, and he would deliberately modify them to make them less similar to real-world languages.
Oh, wow. Well, that would explain why it kept changing so much. So I'm going to bring up a few words here to maybe help our listeners. If they ever do research online, they're going to see some of these words, and maybe even some of our listeners know what these words mean. But this idea of a conlang, could you talk about what a conlang is?
Right. So conlang is an abbreviation for constructed languages, and Quenya and Sindarin, Tolkien's two big Elvish languages, are some of the most famous constructed languages out there, but they're certainly not the only ones. And Tolkien was certainly not the first person to invent a language. People who talk about conlangs, sort of one very broad division in conlangs is between what people call auxiliary languages, which are languages that are built for some sort of practical purpose. Probably the most famous of those is Esperanto, which was invented around the turn of the 19th century as a universal language. And, whether it succeeded in that is an open question. But that was certainly its original intent. And it's pretty widespread at this point. There's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million Esperanto speakers. Wow. But Esperanto was designed to be, to serve a real-world function. The other major category of languages is what people call art languages, which are languages that are constructed for artistic purposes. And so, again, Tolkien was not the first person to do this, but he definitely started a wave of people being interested in using and inventing languages for fictional contexts, and he is kind of the birth of the modern art lang movement, I think, especially in fiction. So prior to Tolkien, people would make up words, but they'd just be sort of random collections of sounds, and after Tolkien, people really thought about, okay, I'm making this imaginary world, we're thinking about things like culture and religion. I really ought to spend some time thinking about what their languages are like as well, and construct a set of sounds and names. Even if I'm just making up a list of names, I should try and spend some time figuring out what sounds can compose those names, so that people can. So the names in the fictional context will actually sound like they're part of the same language and be believable. And if people are really skillful and they have several cultures in their fiction, then they'll create several languages that have different sounds but are similar enough within the language you can tell the difference between one language and another.
So when people invent these languages, like Tolkien, do they? They're not just creating vocabulary, right? Are they also creating the script? Like I remember seeing the word Tengwar, and that's right. Actually how. Well, you would probably better define it than myself, right?
So it really depends. Auxlangs will rarely create their own script because that kind of defeats a lot of their purposes. Usually, Auxlangs are created to sort of facilitate communication in the real world. So Esperanto just uses the regular Latin script that a lot of European languages use, and that's true sometimes for art language. If you're just writing a book, 1 or 2 books in a series, and you're just inventing a language for some of your names, you'll pretty rarely invent your own script because then you've got to pay somebody to make a font for it, and it's very expensive. But a lot of languages do actually go forth and create their own scripts. After the Tolkien's languages, probably the most famous art language would be Klingon,
Sure.
and Klingon has its own script, as well as its own vocabulary and language. But one of the things that Tolkien did, in addition to inventing his language, is he also invented, several scripts, as a matter of fact. The most famous of which is probably the Tengwar script, which you see in the Appendix E of Lord of the Rings. But he also invented the Kiev script, which is a more angular runic script, and he invented several other scripts that we know less about, like Sarati, which is the script of the ancient elves and stuff like that.
Huh. Well, I am curious. I'm curious how did you get into this? I mean, did you study this?
So I'm going to repeat the same thing that a lot of the people you interview say. I started reading Tolkien when I was a kid. I fell in love with it. I read it year after year. I also really liked the languages when I first started reading them. But back when I was reading the books, there just wasn't a whole lot of information available about the languages. There was the appendixes in The Lord of the Rings, there was the appendix in the Silmarillion, and that was basically it. There was no additional information. Yeah. So I kind of lost interest in it after a while, just because there wasn't really much you could do with the languages at the time. And then, when Peter Jackson's movies came out in the early 2000s, I really liked those as well. And there's a lot of Elvish languages in those movies. Like, it's been a while since I looked at this stuff. Maybe I should take another look and see what is out there now. And I discovered that in the intervening 20 years, a whole bunch of new information had been published about the languages, and there was actually quite a bit more that you could study and learn about the languages than you could when I first read the books. So that was what really renewed my interest in the languages. And I'm sure you'll ask me about this later, but I'm a role player. When I first started doing more research in languages, it was motivated by my desire to use the languages in the games that I ran and played in. And that's how I started getting back into the languages sort of this time around.
Well, that's, it's one of the things that I loved most about doing this campaign, and we'll talk about this at the end. I have a few words that we'll be talking about in Quenya that I sort of probably mucked up quite a bit. There were words that I tried to construct, and I tried to put meaning behind, and I totally agree with you about the trying to use them in the games and just how much more rich it makes it. But let's transition right into that. So you're a role player. I remember listening to an interview that you did back in May of 2019 about your experience with White Wolf. It was on I think was it Mage the podcast? Is that right?
Yes.
And so that the whole I remember many years ago, probably 25 years ago, 30 years ago, seeing one of the first White Wolf books come out. Now, was White Wolf your was that how you got into the world of role playing, or did you?
No. I started where almost everybody else started, which is D&D.
Yeah.
D&D was my first role playing game. I pretty much played every edition of Dungeons & Dragons that have come out except for 5th edition, oddly enough.
Huh.
I started the very first role-playing game that I purchased and played was the first edition of AD&D way back in the 70s. So, but I've been role-playing for more than 35 years now. So D&D is a lovely game. I like it a lot, but there's only so much time you could spend playing one game. So I branched out and played many different games over the years. White Wolf is a set of games that I'm very happy with and have played a great deal, but I've played lots of different stuff. You should go through a list of the more famous role-playing games. I probably played it at some point or another. Yeah. I have very eclectic taste when it comes to role-playing games. I like just about anything.
Yeah. And so what is your favorite setting? Would it be like the cyberpunk type, or sort of the more traditional like fantasy setting of if you can call Dungeons and Dragons a fantasy setting? Do you have a preference?
To be honest, I tend to do fantasy and modern fantasy more than the rest, But I've done cyberpunk, sci-fi. I haven't done a lot of non-fantastic stuff. I've done a couple. I played James Bond a little bit when I was in high school. Yeah. Superhero games, I've also done a fair amount of them as well. Probably, I don't really have particularly a favorite. It depends on what I'm in the mood for. I run the games that I tend to run. I look for a story that's of interest to me, or a setting that's of interest to me. And then I'll find a group of people that want to play it, and I'll get together and run it. And I have so many ideas for stuff that I want to run that I bounce around quite a lot.
Yeah.
Mostly what I'm doing right now is the game that I'm running at the moment is a game called Dungeon World, which is kind of a D&D like game based on the Apocalypse Engine rule set. Mm-hmm. The setting that I'm using is a setting called Harn, which is an old game world from the 70s. Or actually, no, I think it was published in the 80s. That is focused on having a relatively realistic, low magic medieval setting. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, but I'm also playing in several other games. I'm playing in a superhero game. I'm playing another game that's sort of a dark thieves world type fantasy setting, and all kinds of other stuff.
Wow, I bow to you. That is an ambitious list. And I just wanted to comment on something you mentioned. One of the things that you're running right now is a low magic setting, and that's kind of how we started this. I became a little more lenient as the characters traveled across the straight road, and I think that I think the players enjoyed that a lot more. How are you finding the low magic setting? Does that open up other avenues for you in role playing?
So the setting is low magic. The characters, the player characters, are not. It's a fantasy game. People want to do fun stuff. So the whole point of the game is to make things enjoyable for the players. So even though the world itself is relatively mundane and there are a few people with magical abilities, the player characters themselves are remarkable individuals that can do cool stuff.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to have their cool toys to play with, and I'm perfectly happy to indulge my players with that.
Nice. Yeah. Well, we we use the Adventures in Middle Earth rule set, at least for the first part of the trilogy, and kind of loosely in the second and third parts. But the folks over at Cubicle 7 provide a nice list of recommended. If you are going to use magic, recommended spells, which I think worked really well. If I could shift gears a little bit, I was wondering. You were talking about. When you first sort of got into the languages, there weren't a lot of things out there, and probably not much internet either when you first got into the Lord of the Rings. But when you came back later, there were more things. So I want to talk to you more about your sources for Eldama, if you could.
Yeah. So the first big set of information that was published was the History of Middle Earth series that Christopher Tolkien put out about his father's journey, so to speak, throughout his life as he assembled the various materials that made up his fictional worlds. Christopher Tolkien didn't specifically focus on the languages, but since languages were such a big and important part of Tolkien's world, he ended up talking about them a fair amount. So there's lots of interesting linguistic information in the History of Middle-earth series, even though that series primarily focuses on the evolution of the narratives. But in the late 90s, there were a group of Tolkien Languages fans that communicated with Christopher Tolkien, sent him a letter saying, hey, you mentioned all these interesting things in the back of the Book of Lost Tales and other books in your History of Middle-earth series. We would like to see more about that. Would you be willing to share that material with us? And Christopher Tolkien agreed. Oh, wow. And there are two linguistic journals. The one's called Minyasercë, and the other one is called Parma Aldalambron. And they've taken the material that Christopher Tolkien generously gave them and have been gradually publishing information from Tolkien's private writings about his language. They've been doing that basically for the last 15 years.
So I've seen those words written. I didn't know how to pronounce them, of course, but I use the Elf dictionary as well as your site quite a bit when I was trying to construct words. I don't know if you've seen the Elf dictionary, but they actually what's that? Oh, okay. Well, they actually reference Eldamo quite a bit on their site. So. That's great. Well, I have to ask: have you had any sort of geek out moments, like fanboy moments, where you've gotten to meet somebody that you consider, an expert in Middle Earth, Tolkien languages, someone close to the Tolkien family, or something similar?
Well, I haven't met anybody in the Tolkien family, but the Tolkien linguistic community is actually pretty small. So if you spend any amount of time in it, you're eventually going to run into the quote-unquote famous people. So the people I talked about earlier, the editors of those two linguistics journals, there's a biannual Tolkien's Language Conference that happens, and I've been to the last two, and 2 years ago, the conference had most of the editors of those journals attend, and I got to meet them all at that time. And at this point, I pretty much know all of them. That particular conference was a weird situation because I hadn't decided whether or not I was going to go or not, because I hadn't been to any of these conferences yet. And they happened to have scheduled the conference to run at a university that's 2 miles from my house. So they do these conferences every 2 years, someplace all over the world. They've been in London, they've been in Switzerland, they've been in France. And it just so happened that the year that I was thinking about going, they did it, in Hayward, California, which is where I live.
Oh, so. That's awesome. So what is this conference called? So the listeners can look it up.
It's Omen Tielva. So the phrase that from Tolkien's books, Elen Sila Lumena Omen Tielvo. So the Omen Tielva conference is inspired by that name. Omen Tielva basically means our meeting, is what it means.
All right. Well, I'll take a look. So if I could at this point, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Quenya specifically, and if you could just tell us a little bit about the Quenya language, and you have already, but this concept of Quenya and Neo-Quenya and anything that you think that the listeners might find interesting about that language and sort of what sort of sets it apart.
Right. So Quenya, as Tolkien conceived of it around when The Lord of the Rings was written, is the native language of. I don't know if you've talked about this before in your podcast, but there's three major tribes of the elves. There's the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. So Quenya is the language of the first two tribes of elves, the Vanyar and the Noldor. And that language is the most widely language spoken in Aman, in Valinor, where the Valar asked the elves to live. The only major other language spoken in Valinor is the language of the Teleri, which is similar to, but slightly different than the Quenya language. And Tolkien didn't actually talk about that particular language very much.
And so most of this, how do we know that the Teleran language is different then?
Well, because Tolkien told us, basically.
Okay, all right, got it. We're taking his word for it.
He didn't spend a lot of time talking about it, but he did write a little bit about it. And he talked about some of the differences. Actually, most of his writing, maybe you can get your other language expert to speak about it. Part of the reason why I talked about Teleri is the older version of Teleri is the ancestral language of Sindarin, the language of the elves that remained in Middle Earth. So that a lot of the time he spent talking about what the Teleran language, he was talking about in the context of how it evolved into the Sindarin language that was spoken in Middle Earth proper.
Right, and that's kind of in the campaign how we've handled it. That in the first part of the campaign, when they're sort of traveling around Middle Earth proper, right, the part that we all know from the books and the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the movies. they encountered a lot of Sindarin, and as they get closer to as they travel across the straight road, right, they start encountering, of course, the Teleran elves and then later on the Spear elves, the Vanyar elves, and then of course the Noldor are kind of everywhere, right? But so actually at this part of the campaign, we're getting some of our first glimpses of the Quenya words, and so these come in the forms of people's names, obviously item names, and if we could, I sent you this list sort of ahead of time, but I have a few words that I wanted to run by you, and you can maybe rate me or grade me on how I did with the words.
Well, so there's something I'd like to say before we actually get into the words.
Yeah, sure.
I can't actually tell you what the right words for the things you're saying would be.
Okay.
So the thing about Tolkien's languages is there are a few things that we could say that would be unquestionably wrong. Like if you used a word like splont, for example, I could tell you unequivocally, no, that's not an Elvish word. That's not a word that Tolkien would have ever used. But saying what the actual right word is becomes very difficult to do. And part of the reason why I emphasize this is people tend to get worked up and a little bit paranoid about being correct, especially when they're studying a new language. So correctness is kind of in the eye of the beholder, especially when you're talking about sort of an imaginary language, a fictional language like Tolkien's language. So if you're running a D&D campaign and you want to pull some names, some words off an Elvish language website, like my site, Eldemo, or the Elfdic site that you mentioned earlier, the Parth Evelyn, and slap them together and make some names for your game. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Especially if you're running a game that's basically for a very small audience. So I want to encourage both you and people who are listening to this, if you want to play around with the language, slap things together, experiment with them, come up with cool sounding names. I would not spend a lot of time worrying about whether or not those names are correct or not, unless you really feel like you want to dig into the languages and learn them in all their gory details, of which there are quite a few. That's fine for most practical purposes. Essentially, what you're doing is you're running a game for a very small audience. You're using Tolkien's language as a resource to come up with cool names. And, whether you're right or not, it's kind of an open.
So I expected this to come up in my next interview because the Sindarin expert that I mentioned is a friend of yours, actually, Fiona Jawlings.
Yeah.
Am I saying her last name correctly? Jawlings.
Yeah.
She teaches classes on Sindarin and has written a book on Neo-Sindarin, and she talks a lot about this, what you just mentioned, and especially in the introduction to her book, about the idea of creating the what's correct and what's not correct, and in fact most of the spoken Sindarin that's out there is really Neo-Sindarin, right? Created by fans, essentially, right? Does that sound right?
No, that's correct. So that's kind of a topic that a question you asked that I didn't answer earlier. So when it comes to the languages, sort of my view is the goal of Tolkien's languages is not to figure out what is right, but the goal is not to be right. The goal is to be less wrong.
Right.
So in terms of studying Tolkien's languages, you can't really learn Tolkien languages in the way that you would learn a real-world language. And you can't even really learn Tolkien languages in the way that you can a lot of other invented languages. Like, if you wanted to learn Klingon, there's a Klingon dictionary that's been published. It's got a dictionary, it's got a grammar, it's got a lot of rules about what the languages are. You can just go buy the Klingon dictionary and read through it and get a basic idea of how Klingon works. Tolkien's languages, unfortunately, don't work that way. Tolkien never gave us a dictionary. He never finished working on an Elvish grammar for any of his languages. What we have about his languages is all in fragments. So we're kind of forced into the unfortunate position of piecing through the material that he left us, trying to figure out what he was aiming at, and trying to assemble something that resembles a functional language out of what he left behind. A lot of people in this field these days sort of divide the study of Tolkien's languages up in sort of two arenas. There's the study of the languages as Tolkien himself wrote them, and when people talk about that, they tend to talk about things like Quenya and Sindarin unqualified. And then there is the attempt to take the fragments of his language and put them together into a format that somebody might actually use for conversation. And because Tolkien himself did not determine those things, these reconstructions or collections of information, people tend to talk about them in terms of things like, they tend to use labels like Neo-Quenya and Neo-Sindarin as a way of clarifying that these are things that are building on what Tolkien wrote but aren't necessarily exactly what Tolkien wrote.
Can I ask you related to this? I'm wondering how the community felt about the movies in terms of language. Now, was David Sallow was the sort of the person that helped the cast members learn the language, correct, during the movies?
Yeah,
do you know? Okay, so how did the community feel about the languages spoken in the movies?
Well, again, it depends. So one of the things about Tolkien linguistics is, things that were right back in the early 2000s, we may not consider those to be correct at all. They're not necessarily completely correct now, because new information is being published all the time. The way that I tend to advocate that people think about Tolkien's languages, you're not just studying an imaginary language. What you're effectively doing, you're studying an imaginary dead language. You're studying a language that doesn't really exist anymore, but it's kind of like if you were researching ancient Egyptian, to use a real-world analogy. So there's a lot of information. There's lots of published texts in ancient Egyptian. They're scattered over many thousands of years of material. There are various scholars that sort of go through the information, try to assemble things, and try to figure out how the languages work. And the same way that every now and again somebody's going to find some new papyruses that give us more insight into the way ancient Egyptian worked. Every now and again, new unpublished material is released about Tolkien's languages, and then we have to take that new unpublished material, incorporate it into the things that we know about the languages. In some cases, it confirms things that we'd already built. In other cases, it contradicts them, and we have to figure out how to reconcile them.
Oh, wow.
So the way that our understanding of the languages back in the early 2000s, when David Sallow was educating people on how to speak in the Lord of the Rings movies, a lot of what he did was still probably considered valid, but some of the stuff that he did is unfortunately these days considered to be a bit iffy.
Okay.
So that's just kind of the nature of the beast and how things work. That's why we tend to use these languages like Neo-Quenya and Neo-Sindarin about things, because we have to bear in mind that we're still learning about the languages and we're still studying them. And so we don't necessarily even understand everything that Tolkien did yet, because not all the information is available.
So you mentioned, you sort of made the comparison to ancient Egyptian. I remember reading an article that you published on this, so people can read more about this. You have blog entries on realelvish.net, is that correct?
That's correct.
So there's that. So let me come back to the words that I was going to share with you from the campaign, and maybe I'll rephrase it instead of giving me a check or a check plus about the words how I did. Maybe I can just share them with you and now
that I'm giving you my copy out, I'm perfectly comfortable trashing your words.
Oh, so. Perfect. Oh, good. I remember telling you that via email. I'm totally fine with you trashing my words. I'm totally fine with that. So the first one, speaking of the Vanyar elves, the characters are right now traveling through the land of elms, and will come to the Cottage of Lost Play, and will eventually make it over to right basically on Eldamar, in Eldamar, they'll come to a port town and will be given a gift from the king of the Vanyar, and this, of course, because they're the spear elves that live in sort of close proximity to the Valar, will be a spear, and the spear's name was called Ennayór. So Ennayór, and for me, what I was going for was for it to mean first blood in Quenya. What do you think of that?
Okay, so about this word. So the two elements of this word that you're using, enna and yor, both of those words come from the Etymologies, which is a document that Tolkien put together in the 1930s, sort of about halfway through his life. Now, unfortunately, the first of those elements they use, enna, they use as your word for first, that one comes from an entry in the Etymology that Tolkien deleted.
Oh, no.
So because he deleted it, not a lot of people would use that word as the word for first. There's another word that he used later on, minya, that is probably the most commonly used word for first. And he talked about that particular word in great detail, and we have a lot of confidence that that is the word that he eventually settled on as the word for first in Elvish. There's sort of two basic roots that mean one in Elvish. It's mean and but means one single thing alone. It's used for words like erasia, lonely.
Oh, yeah.
It is by itself. Mean, however, means one in the sense of first in a series. So the Elvish word for one when you're counting is mean, and the word for first is minya.
Ah, see, this is going exactly the way I thought it would go. This is good. No, this is what I was going for.
So as for the second element, yor is actually, whether yor is a valid word or not is a matter of case. It's a word that Tolkien had in the 1930s. There's nothing in Tolkien's later writing that really contradicts whether or not you could use the word yor for blood or not. However, there is another word that Tolkien invented later on, serke, which also means blood. And since that word, I think he invented it in the 50s or the 60s, it appears in the versions of the Silmarillion that were eventually published. That's probably the word that people will be more likely to use for blood than yor. Also, minya yor sounds a little clumsy. I think Minyasercë probably sounds a bit better.
Ooh, that does sound good.
If I were to say first blood as the name of the spear, I would say Minyasercë.
See, that's perfect. That actually does sound really good. Thank you. All right, moving on to the second one, since I've kept you for almost 40 minutes now. Was the name of a player character, and I particularly loved this name, mostly not because of the name, but mostly where the name came from. And in looking back at how I built the name, I have some questions about, like, what the heck was I thinking? But this was about our elf, who is the fictitious brother of Celebrimbor. His name was Ezellendur, and Ezellendur was named after the green mound upon which the two trees of Valinor stood. Of course, that mound was called Ezellohar. I'll let you break down the word, but I was hoping that this word would mean something like servant of the green mound.
Well, it might mean servant of green. So Ezello is a word that means green. But Ezello is a word that means green in the Vanyarin dialect of Quenya, not the Noldorin dialect. Okay. Ezello is kind of an interesting word because it's one of the very few words that we know from the Valoran language. The Vanyar, who were very close to the Valar, they actually spent a fair amount of time working with them. Now, the Eldar didn't really like the Valoran language. It sounded kind of harsh to them, so they didn't use it very much. But there were a few words like Ezellohar, which was originally adapted from the Valoran name of that mound. So Ezello is a perfectly fine word for green if you were a Vanyar, but unfortunately it doesn't really work for somebody who is a Noldor. And part of the reason why is that Z sound, the Z, is a language that was in the Vanyarin dialect of Quenya, but not in the Noldorin dialect of Quenya. If you look in the Lord of the Rings appendix, Tolkien talks about the evolution of one of the Tengwar letters, which was called either Are or Esse. It's a little double S sign. Mm-hmm. That letter was originally used for the letter Z. But in the Noldorin dialect, the letter Z, so the original name of the letter was Aze, meaning day. But in the Noldorin dialect, over time, the Z sound came to be pronounced like R. Oh. So the name of the letter changed from Aze to Are, and then because they no longer needed a separate letter for it, because there was another letter, Ore, that was used for R as well, sort of those words that had the Tengwar Are in it, they began to use Ore instead, and the letter that was originally used for a Z sound came to represent a double S sound, and they changed the name of the letter from Are to Esse.
So that name's totally wrong.
Well, not totally wrong. It would probably be fine if we were talking about a Valoran elf, a Vanyarin elf.
Yeah.
Right. A Vanyarin elf, but not so much for an Oldrin. Now, for a Northern elf, if you want to say a servant of the mound, the more common Quenya name for Ezellendur is Corolare, which basically literally means mound of summer. So I would probably use the name Corondur for servant of the mound.
Ooh, that's a good one. And it would be emphasized like that, Corondur?
Yes. So the stress rules for Quenya is basically you put the stress on the second to last syllable if that syllable is long, meaning it either has a long letter or ends in a pair of consonants. Otherwise, you put it on the third from the end.
Ah.
So Corondur, the stress goes in the middle because that syllable has an ND in it, whereas something like Eldamo, for example, if that were an Elvish word, the stress would go in the first syllable because the second syllable is just AM, it's a short syllable. Ah.
Well, I actually really like that name a lot. And if I were, again, turning this into fan fiction, I would adopt that name. You actually, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned, so you called the language that the Valar speak Valoran, and that's different than what I thought. I was actually thinking more of like Game of Thrones. I thought it was Valeran. That's not right, though.
Well, it's the same story, right? So Valoran, the second syllable is AR, so that's a short syllable, which means the stress goes on the first syllable.
Got it. Okay. Valoran. All right, and the last word that I want to bring up, and this is going to sound very familiar because of a place name in Beleriand, but this was a character that I was really proud of, mostly because, again, it wasn't my character, but it was named after an Avathari, which was a race I made up, of course, named after the region that Ungoliant came from, and we started thinking, of course, that there were probably other creatures out there in the world similar to Ungoliant, if you can be at least partially similar to Ungoliant. And this character's name was Mor-lómin, which sounds very similar to Dor-lómin, but its name meant I was going for the dark shadow or something like that. So how'd I do on that one?
Well, so Dor-lómin does indeed mean the land of shadows. Unfortunately, it only meant the land of shadows back in the 1910s and 1920s. That was the original meaning of the name when Tolkien first wrote The Lost Tales, his sort of earliest iterations of the Silmarillion. Sometime around the 1930s, Tolkien changed his mind about what that name meant. He kept the name Dor-lómin, but he decided that it meant the land of echoes rather than the land of shadows. It was named after basically the pained cry of Morgoth when he was defeated in one of the times that Morgoth was defeated. I forget exactly which one. So that Lómin, unfortunately, no longer means shadow. At least not in the languages as Tolkien used him in the 1950s or 60s.
Dark echoes, is that what that word would mean then?
Dark echoes is what that word would mean. As to how to actually say dark shadow, that's actually a little tricky. The words for light and shadow, Tolkien invented a lot of words for light and shadow.
Yes, he did.
So there are a lot of different words for shadow with different shades of meaning. So we probably need to have like a 15, 20-minute conversation about it. Just kind of figure out exactly what kind of connotation you want the name to have in order to figure out the best name for shadow in that case. But if I have to do something off the cuff, I might suggest Lumbe is another word for shadow that you might use in that circumstance. Lumbe. But that one's a little more. That's a little more subjective as to which exactly would be the best word for you to use. The other ones were easier This one I don't have a concrete suggestion off the top of my head.
What about the prefix, I should say, the more?
Prefix Mor is actually fine. Prefix Mor for dark is actually a word that Tolkien established very, very early. He invented it in the 1910s, and he pretty much kept it for his entire life. So stuff does actually change in Tolkien's languages, but there are a lot of other things where he came up with an idea very early on, and then he just kept it.
Yeah.
So Mor was the word for darkness in the 1910s and stayed the same all the way up through the 1970s, as in like Mordor, for example.
All right, so I got that one half right. If there is such a thing as right.
It's all subjective.
Yeah.
When people name things, it's an art rather than a science. And there's lots of different options you can go about building stuff. A good conversation you might have with Fiona, since we've been going for so long, is some of the rules that elves use for naming languages. She's actually spent more time researching that than I have. So that might be a good question to ask her.
Okay, I will do that. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you again for coming. I know I've kept you a long time, but this was a lot of fun. And is there anything else you want to talk about or plug before we go?
Well, my site, eldemo.org, if people are interested in the languages, is a good place to go. I've also hang out on Fiona's site, realelvish.net. There's another site that I attend called Auxilary, which also has a lot of Elvish language stuff in it. I don't know if I actually have a link to it on my site, but Fiona might.
Okay.
So that's another community that's worth hanging out with.
All right. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care.